Hi, I'm Bill Baarsma. I'm your moderator today, and typically I'm on the other end of the question and answer sessions as a council member, but today I have the privilege and the honor to moderate a community conversation with a couple of friends of mine. One person in particular, a notable Tacoman, a person I've known for 20 years as a friend, at least 20 years, a person that I've known of for a lot longer than that. As a matter of fact, if you're born and raised in Tacoma and you grew up in Tacoma, you would know the name of my guest, particularly if you're interested in sports. My guest has been a sportscaster, a sports promoter. He's been a journalist and a businessman. He's been an elected official and a Tacoma booster. And I guess an all-around nice guy and a person who's contributed a great deal to the city of Tacoma. And my guest today is Clay Huntington. Clay, welcome.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here. And along with Clay, I have as a guest a former cohort of mine from the University of Puget Sound, a former athletic director and a friend of mine and a friend of Clay's, to kind of join in the conversation and do a little reminiscing about Tacoma's history and some of the sporting events of the past. Doug McArthur. Doug, thanks for being here.
Bill, nice to be with you.
All right. Now, actually, I'm going to talk with Clay about his many lines of work over the past, and I think that part of that experience as a sports promoter began with a conversation you had with Tacoma's mayor some time back when you were a student at Lincoln High School. But before I get to that, I'd like to kind of talk about a more current event, one that just occurred over the weekend. And it's a question to you, Clay, and the question is, in your wildest dreams, did you ever imagine that 90,000 people would jam the Rose Bowl to watch the Women's World Cup Championship event, and to have a viewing audience that was comparable to the NFL and NBA playoffs? Have you ever thought that that might come to be? What's your take on that?
Well, you know, frankly, I thought if they drew 20,000, it would be a major crowd, major attraction. Just amazing. You get 90,000 for anything. Mm-hmm. But it shows how women's soccer has developed, and certainly I think it's far out past the men as far as a spectator attraction.
Now, as a kind of a person who's skilled in advertising and marketing, do you have any theories as to why this has become so phenomenally popular and such a big event?
Well, you know, frankly, and I think Doug would agree to this, sometimes you have to paper a house to get a large crowd. And when you think of 90,000 paid, and I'm assuming the entire 90,000 was paid, that in itself is an astonishing figure. Even if you papered the house, you would be lucky to get 90,000. But it just shows that the youth development of not only girls soccer, but boys soccer, from that grassroots level, certainly has developed the sport from that standpoint and participation. Now it's become a spectator sport, and I don't even think the initial promoters of a women's World Cup even dreamed in their wildest thoughts would ever draw that many people. In foreign countries, yes, but not in the U.S.
Right. Well, one of the interesting takes on that is that there was a program on, I believe, NBC. They talked about the marketing of this, and one would assume that the marketing would be directed toward the soccer moms that would bring their daughters to the game. But actually, the marketing was directed toward the soccer dads, and it was an opportunity for the fathers and dads to bring their daughters to a game and to bond with them and to really enjoy a common experience. It's really tough. I mean, we can all relate to our sons, those of us who are dads, but it's a little tougher to kind of develop that relationship.
Well, I have a granddaughter that plays soccer, and I go to her games, and you know, I get a great thrill out of watching the girls play. And she's a pretty talented athlete, a little better basketball player than she is soccer, but still, she enjoys the sport and is dedicated to it.
You know, it's interesting. I'm glad that Doug was able to join with us today, because he was the athletic director during the 1970s at the University of Puget Sound, and it was during that period that Title IX came to be. And you see reference to Title IX and a lot of comments about how this really made a difference in terms of women's intercollegiate athletics and women's sports. You experienced that. I guess my first question, Doug, is what is Title IX, and what effect has it had, or what effect did it have in intercollegiate athletics in your experience?
Well, Bill, by and large, Title IX said that women in this country will have equal opportunity with men in the area of high school and intercollegiate athletics. And it has had a dramatic impact, but I was there before that, and then when it happened, and I can tell you that the impetus was underway. It was going to happen, forced or not. Now, it might not happen everywhere, and it might not happen as quickly, but it was going to happen. There's no question. And I have a little different take on the women's soccer appeal. Because I think you know I have had 17 years with the Safeco Classic and the LPGA golf tournament. And long ago, I decided that I would rather watch the women play golf than the men play golf. And I think there's something to that. And it's for a lot of different reasons. But the one thing that strikes me about it is that it's sort of a testimony to what's going on in the world of sports right now. I think people want to relate more to people. And I'm not sure that the male professional athlete hasn't gone above and beyond being a person. And I think it's the greatest danger that faces professional sports today in the men's world. The women are real. They are in the golf circuit. They are in the soccer. They're for real. They don't have all of this falseness and all of these dollars and all of these huge egos and, you know.
Well, you know, this year I had invited the University of Puget Sound women's swim team to the council chambers. We had a proclamation declaring a Tacoma Day for the women champions. And I mentioned the fact that when you go into the UPS field house, there's plaques of former students and student athletes and coaches that are part of the UPS Hall of Fame, Sports Hall of Fame. And there's a swimmer there that won a gold medal and won two gold medals and set a world's record. And I made mention of that there's this swimmer that's in the Sports Hall of Fame that was never able to win an event for the UPS swim team and was never able to go to the nationals. And all the women swimmers were kind of baffled and puzzled when I posed that question, but the coach knew who I was talking about. And I was talking about Kay Hall, who was a student at the University of Puget Sound and graduated in 1972, the year that Title IX became a reality. And there was no UPS women's swim team or basketball team prior to 1972. So a real interesting question that I've posed, and really illustrates, I think, the impact of Title IX. Now, as it turns out, another question I wanted to kind of pose to you, and that is the staying power of this. Are we likely to see a women's professional soccer team, do you think? I know that right now the WNBA is kind of doing reasonably well, and they're going to have a sellout for their All-Star game at Madison Square Garden. What do you think, Clay?
You know, that's a tough question to answer at this time. Certainly, when they're amateurs, it's a little different game than when they're pros, and they may take the stance of the men pros. And I think what's turned off, and Doug probably would agree with this, the salaries that are paid now and the business enterprise that pro men's sports actually is, it's turned some people off. When the multi-million-dollar salaries, people say, hey, we're paying them too much, I'm going to turn to another sport. And that may be why the Women's World Cup grew as well as it did. It's still, I suppose, in a narrow gauge, still amateur.
Yeah, it's interesting because there was an article in this morning's paper, and of course it was interesting because it talked about the tour that the team's going on, and they're going to be in Philadelphia and Detroit and Washington, D.C. and New York and Anaheim and San Jose, and it turns out they're going to be in Tacoma. They're going to be in Tacoma because of the Tacoma Dome, which you two gentlemen helped bring to be, made it happen. And so, and the other part of that piece is that it illustrated that all of the women on the team are likely to be millionaires by the end of this tour. So it will be interesting to see whether they're just they're as wholesome and as genuine and can relate as well at the end. And I think that perhaps will be the test, and whether they'll have that appeal.
You know, it's so tremendous, Bill, and Doug played a major role in the Tacoma Dome. We lost a couple times prior to the final success, but how much that dome has meant for the city of Tacoma.
It's been a tremendous asset.
A tremendous asset.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Bill, I think that a real tribute to the dome and some of the decisions that were made along the way is we couldn't build the best indoor baseball stadium or the best indoor football stadium or the best concert hall. We built the most versatile dome in America, and that, I think, is what we've got. And it's, you know, that the soccer team could come here. If we'd have gone with studies, we'd have had an arena-sized facility and no possibility.
Yeah, you went with your instincts. That this was
well, we wanted something for everyone, and that's what the city told us.
Right. Right.
We want to graduate our classes there because we don't have big enough places now. We want our kids out of the mud. At that time, you know, the football games, high school football games are being played in the mud. They wanted something. They wanted hockey. It was great. Choices to be made, tough choices to be made. Did we include ice in that and all it cost? Well, yeah. And in 1987, Tacoma hosted the United States Figure Skating Championships as a result. We've got a professional hockey franchise as a result. Those are tough decisions because we couldn't have ideal sightlines. We couldn't have perfect facility. But we've certainly got a versatile one.
And it came in on time and under budget, too.
I think that's true.
That's sweet. I don't want to comment about other stadiums, but that's certainly sweet.
And he said, I played a major role. I want to assure you, he not only played a major role in that one, but every other facility I can think of in Tacoma. We can get into that a little later.
Heidelberg Park and Stadium, Cheney Stadium, and others as well. A little over a month ago, we had an event in Tacoma, and it was to recognize the good work that you've done, Clay, and opportunity for a kind of a celebration of the good things and the contributions and the history of Clay Huntington. And it was about 3 hours of proclamations and stories and good-natured ribbing and some outrageous jokes by Herb Gelman. I got to tell you, I followed Herb to the mic, and my mind was completely blank. I couldn't say anything. I was really struggling. But at the end of this event, after all of that, all those accolades and the joy that we had, you came to the microphone and just said a few words of thank you and recognition. Two thoughts kind of crossed my mind. First, I thought to myself, golly, hundreds of thousands of people have heard that voice and recognize that voice. Maybe 1 million people recognize it. That was the first thought that crossed my mind. Secondly, when you think of a sports promoter or a sports broadcaster, you think of a gregarious kind of glad-handing person, not someone that's self-effacing and somewhat reserved, which is your persona, which almost seems like a contradiction in terms. And so I was wondering then, and I'll ask you the question now, how did this all begin? How did this come to pass, this career of yours?
Well, I think it went back as a kid broadcasting out of a tree in our neighborhood.
Really?
We played baseball in a rather primitive area out in 45th in Alaska a long time ago. And I dreamed then that I liked Tacoma. I've been here all my life, although I was born in Vancouver. I came here at 5 months old, so I think I'm a native Tacoman. But I just thought so much of Tacoma that it could develop, even though at the time in the late 20s and early 30s, it was a blue-collar and always taking a second to Seattle, the big city up north. And I just thought that it had tremendous possibilities and always believed in Tacoma, and it's a great place to live, and I'm pleased that I could contribute a small portion of my time to developing in some minor way the good of the city of Tacoma.
So you started your play-by-play watching kids playing in the street, kind of practicing there in the street.
In fact, I was playing too. I included myself in that. But
were you the star, Clay? When you
yeah, absolutely.
Of course.
A 300, 400 hitter and all that. But no, and I get kidded quite a bit because a lot of people say, well, I can remember Clay when he was up in that tree. Emulating Leo Lassen or somebody like that. Yeah,
and then you went on to Lincoln High School, and there was a story in the News Tribune. John McGrath wrote about a meeting you had with the mayor at that time, and why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that, and you know, it never came to pass what I initially went to the mayor, Mayor Harry Kane, who was a very progressive, outgoing, gregarious guy.
Yeah.
And Billy Sewell was a top-notch name in local athletes, went to Lincoln, went to WSU, and was in the 2nd Bomber Command in Spokane. And I thought, gee, we could bring him in, we could draw a big crowd at the Stadium Bowl, and if we could get March Air Force in California and promote this as a charitable game. It never came to pass because March Air Force wouldn't come up and play the 2nd Bomber Command. But out of that, Harry Kane called a group of Tacomans, not only school officials, but civic leaders and a few politicians, Bill, in the midst. And out of that came the formation of the War Athletic Commission. And I was, at the time, the youngest member just in high school, so I didn't think the mayor would give me much thought in what I was trying to promote. But he did, and from that, that was the initial War Athletic Commission, and then it evolved into the Tacoma Athletic Commission.
Which is still very active today.
Very active.
And contributing to the community. And then after high school, you went into the Second World War and served in the Navy. It's my understanding. And then upon returning to Tacoma after service for your country, you started in your broadcasting career and journalistic career. How did that come to pass?
Well, the broadcasting, as well as the old Tacoma Times, was a daily newspaper competing with the Tribune, and they had a very small staff. In fact, Elliot Metcalf was the sports staff, and I was the young kid going to UPS or CPS at the time, and putting out the Saturday sport page all by myself, and eventually putting out the Sunday. They went Sunday for about nine weeks and then folded. But I got my journalistic background from the Tacoma Times. Not only wrote the stories, but wrote the headlines, made up the pages. Unheard of today, a college kid being the entire sports staff. But out of that, and plus the broadcasting that we did the old WI League Tacoma Tigers back in '46, and the Tacoma Rockets hockey team, and PLU, PLC, and CPS, and all the games, and all the high school games. But combining all that, it was just a love of sports that I proceeded along that bent. But it certainly, looking back, was something that the memories I cherish.
You called the play-by-play for the Tacoma Tigers when they were in that Class B league. What was it, the Western International League?
WI League, right.
What were some of the other, do you recall some of the other cities or teams that were in that league?
Spokane, Vancouver, Yakima, Salem, Victoria. And then eventually, there was one team that was in that league in the late 30s, Lewiston, Idaho. Oh. They set a record of 23 straight defeats and gave up the ghost. But it was a pretty good league. They had a lot of young kids that were trying to advance to what then was the AA Coast League. But it was in the late 40s. Well, going back to the late 30s when they played up on 12th and Sprague, or 15th and Sprague, I guess, at Old Athletic Park. And then moving out to 38th Street in the late 40s.
I still remember that, by the way, that field.
I was a kid at that time, and that's the site now of Puget Sound Energy, Washington Natural Gas.
That's right.
That's where the Tiger Park was at the time. And so, of course, Clay was, to me, like Leo Lassen was to him, although I, too, remember Leo Lassen. In fact, one of the great thrills of my life came in '56 when Clay and Stan Nacaraudo put on a banquet for us. We had a group of kids from Tacoma went back and won the national championship in amateur baseball.
Oh, yeah.
They were college-age kids, so I shouldn't call them kids, I guess. But anyway, the Stanley Schumann, and we won the national championship. And they arranged for our guest speaker to be Leo Lassen.
Really?
All of those years that I grew up, listened to it, and never had seen him in my life. And I can to this day recall he stood up in front of our banquet and said, "Good evening, this is Leo Lassen," which is how he always started his broadcast. And I was flabbergasted. But at that time, Clay was our voice, and all of the kids in our era remember Clay with his case. He had a pet statement, like so many of them do. The deuces prevail. And Clay, you can tell him that that's 2 and 2 on the hitter with 2 outs and 2 on, right? 2 in. And
well, I really use that from a broadcaster in L.A.
Oh, you did?
A guy by the name of Kelly, and that was his favorite saying. But of course, no one in those days ever heard of anyone out of Los Angeles. But you mentioned Leo Lassen. We put him in the State Hall of Fame, and it was his last public appearance. He died shortly after we put him in. And we had the State Hall of Fame that year was held out at the Elks Club. And I thought it would be neat if we had a lot of kids there too, about 1,000 people, and maybe 200 or 300 kids who had never heard of Leo Lassen. So I said, Leo, why don't you recreate a portion of an inning? And he did, and the kids were just roaring with laughter. They thought it was a put-on. But that was actually Leo Lassen. And of course, we remember, I remember him when he first took over in 1932. The broadcaster for the Seattle Indians at the time out at Dugdale Park in Seattle got sick. And Leo came in, and they almost, today, they wouldn't let him in the studio. They'd say, hey.
Right.
He was a newspaper.
He was, he was the writer.
Never been on the air before.
Editor of the Seattle Star and then the Seattle PI.
You know, you could walk the streets of Tacoma or most communities during the summer months and listen and hear those Rainier ball games, you know, and Leo Lassen with that nasal twang, back. I can still remember that.
You know, goes a lot faster than that, Bill. Back, back, and it's over!
That's true.
And he's never been hit by a foul ball.
You don't know what you missed, oh baby!
Yeah, it's great.
But he was a legend, and
truly.
But that was a long time ago.
Well, that was one character.
That
was one character that of course, you knew during your experience in broadcasting, and obviously you broadcasted some great games and saw some great games. Can you think of some of the memorable players and games of your experience come to mind?
Well, just the one thing I didn't broadcast, but I was at the Cheney Stadium, the Marichal Ripplemeyer.
That was true.
And that's something that I think all Tacomans remember. 2-1,
right.
Jam-packed crowd.
Right.
Rosie Ryan was the GM.
Right.
He didn't expect a large crowd that night. And he thought maybe they'd have 5,000 or 6,000, and they came from all over.
They were standing in the outfield.
Standing, and even up on the what they call a tightwad terrace up at Foss High School. They were jammed, and that was a game that probably of a baseball game in Tacoma, the most memorable one. Yeah. There was one, however, in the old Tacoma Stadium prior to my time. I was about 4 or 5 years old, when the Tacoma City League played the Seattle Indians in an exhibition game, and Bruce Blevins, you remember
Horse
Blevins, and his son went to CBS.
Sure did.
And he beat Seattle 2-1 at the stadium. And you know, I did not see the game, but I often wonder, with those poor lights in the early days, anyone with a real fastball, blinding speed, the batter couldn't see it because the lights were so poor at the stadium.
Well, it goes back also to that Tacoma City League was laden with players who were professional prospects. In today's market, they'd be in the majors or in AAA ball. There were that many, that good.
Wow.
They really were.
Well, Dick Greco, he played for the Tacoma Tigers, did he not?
In the 40s, right.
Yeah, did you see him play?
Oh, yes.
Broadcast his games.
He could hit that ball almost, didn't he?
Tremendous. I often, you know, they claim that Dick played the outfield not to the best defensive possibility, but he could hit. He hit one, Bill, one-handed. The center field fence at the old Tiger Park at
435.
435. He hit one-handed over the center field fence. I think the longest ball, you talk about Mark McGuire and Sosa and Griffey. Greco would be on a par with them with power.
Of course,
he calls him Greco because in the old WI League, he was Dick Greco.
Dick Greco.
Yeah, and there, you know, Greco's Gardens developed in center field out at Tiger Park, too. Wow. That was his home run haven. They shortened the fence a little bit and put in a section.
Frank Gillihan, who was on the school board, thought the idea of let's shorten that fence. And the fence was still there, but they put a temporary portable fence. And but Dick could hit it.
It didn't matter.
400 or 500
Never
feet.
made it to the majors. Why? Do you have any theories as to couldn't hit the slider or?
Well, probably.
Yeah.
Couldn't, the curveball may have given him a little trouble.
Although the opportunities just weren't there.
Yeah.
I mean, think of with the expansion, guys that are in the majors that shouldn't be there today.
That's
Pardon
true.
me, all professional athletes, but it's the truth.
Much tougher in those days. A lot more players in the minor leagues.
Well, look at the Lou Novikovs and the Bill Lawrences and those guys in the Pacific Coast League.
Yeah.
They were, in effect, the major league players of today.
Right.
They didn't have a designated hitter in those days because his defensive skills were lacking a little bit. But that may have held him, but he did go to San Diego and briefly.
Canseco was here in Tacoma. I saw him in his prime. I saw Greco in his prime. Not a lot of difference.
Well, I saw Frank Howard hit the ball over the center field fence at Cheney Stadium, which is the longest ball I'd ever seen. I think it broke out a window. in a car that was parked in the parking lot. Whoa, and that baby went just like a shot right over the center field.
Yeah.
And then I was there when Tom Haller hit 3 home runs. I don't know if you were there.
I remember
game.
that. I should have remembered that.
And of course, I was there for the Marichal Ripplemeyer game. It was unbelievable.
Yeah, that was a tremendous game.
I was doing the PA at that time at Cheney Stadium, and it was a great thrill, no question about it.
We talked early on, and you were at the game, and when I say the game, this is when the College of Puget Sound Loggers in 1948 squared off against the University of Washington Huskies at the Armory, and that game kind of took on an era because when I grew up. I used to hang out at Pat's Place. You know, remember Pat's Place? It was a hangout for the College of Puget Sound.
Had a few burgers and beers.
And, well, I had burgers and shakes. I was a little too young for burger and beer, but
I was too.
Oh, didn't check your ID, Doug. Of course, Pat Jr. and I grew up, so they knew how old I was. But I remember those pictures on the walls of those great players from the College of Puget Sound, and they were terrific players: Bobby Angeline and Bob Fincham and Rod Gibbs and those players. And of course I heard about the game and you two were at that game.
Yep.
It was jam-packed at the Armory. In those days, CPS and PLC used to play in the Armory. And
I remember that was our biggest venue in town.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Prior to the field house.
That's right. And the field house opened that spring, I believe.
And the following year.
The following year it was open for business. And the University of Washington was the defending Pacific Coast Conference champions, coming in with an All-American by the name of
Sammy White. Yeah. Later the catcher with the Boston Red Sox.
Right. What happened in that game, Doug?
Well, it was a great night for Tacoma.
Yeah.
And Clay brought up this earlier, Tacoma versus Seattle. That's
right.
Rosie wasn't from here, Rosie Ryan.
Right.
He couldn't estimate what it meant to Tacomans to play Seattle in Cheney Stadium and beat them.
Right.
That type of thing, that was there.
Right.
Not only the size of the two schools, but the Huskies with all their publicity and all that aura and everything. And the Loggers beat them 48-41. Wasn't the first time, by the way, that CPS has beaten Washington. In basketball, never in football, although one year it was 13-6 in the Tacoma Stadium. But anyway, going back to that, it was 48-41. And the Huskies had just come back from Champaign-Urbana and beaten Illinois twice in a weekend series back there. So it was kind of interesting that. And Bobby Fincham had 15 in that era. Those were big points. Bobby later against College of Idaho had 43 and 33 on successive nights here in the Logger gym.
Wow.
Anyway, he had 15, and Dick Brown checked Sammy White. Dick Brown was a great all-around athlete out of Stadium High School here in Tacoma. I think he'd gone to Wazoo and then went in the service, and when he came back, at that era, when the good athletes came back, they all came back home.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to go to anywhere. So they went to CPS and PLC.
Yeah. Well, of course,
so there were great athletes.
They sure were. And of course, also after the Korean War, a lot of these fellows came back too. And the College of Puget Sound in those days was a townie school. Over half the students were from the city of Tacoma and almost all from the state of Washington. And I was a townie at the time. Of course, it's a very different institution now, but it was very close to the community, and that was the big game, and certainly something that I grew up with. We're going to take a break right now. We continue our discussion after the break and talk about some other activities and some of the things that Clay's done. Talk about the political aspect of Clay Huntington's career. So we'll be back in a minute. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Ozzie Timmons with the Tacoma Rainiers. As a baseball player, I have many jobs: batting, running, fielding. But my biggest job is making sure I'm safe at home. Parents and teens have a job to do too. Tacoma has a curfew for kids under 18, and the curfew is helping to reduce crime. So be safe at home this summer. It's a job for all of us. Hey, let's get another strike in here.
Welcome back, and I'm having a great conversation with two friends, Clay Huntington and Doug McArthur. This is a community conversation, and I wanted to ask Clay a question. We talked about that great game with Mon Marichal and Ray Ripplemeyer when Seattle and Tacoma squared off in Cheney Field. By the way, I was at that game. I'm not sure whether I was on Tightwad Hill or not, but I remember watching that game because just about everyone either listened to the game or was there. It was really quite an experience. And those first few years were really exciting years, and great players where Willie Mays played in center field when San Francisco came in with that exhibition game, and they were great Tacoma players. Not only Juan Marichal, I mentioned Tom Haller and Jose Pagan and Bob Perry kind of roamed center field. Another guy that probably would have made it to the majors, you know, in today's time. He just couldn't quite make it there. Was a great player. But there was a time in which almost a cataclysmic event occurred sports-wise, and that's when the Giants decided to pull their AAA franchise out of Tacoma and move to Albuquerque. And people were really in a state of shock, and I think the feeling was this might be the end of AAA ball in Tacoma, or maybe minor league ball, but this could be the end. And I remember actually at that time I was working up in the city manager's office, and there were a lot of people were quite concerned. And then you and some other folks, I think Stan and I don't know, Doug, if you were involved in that, but I know you were, to kind of come in and save the day. How did that all come about? How'd you rescue AAA ball?
Well, I think the inquiry was with the Chicago Cubs, and they decided that they would buy the franchise. And I'm trying to recall, I think, what Dave Rollins, the
yes,
city manager, and he
right.
played a major role, and he was a great baseball fan.
Right.
And I talked to him occasionally.
He lives in Tacoma.
He lives here. And they contacted the Wrigley interest in Chicago, and they decided to put the franchise in Tacoma, outright ownership. And ironically, they operated 6 years. And then the Tacoma group took over.
Right.
Stan got on the phone one morning and decided that we could call, he did it at the radio station and said we can put together 20 guys at 5,000 each, and which he did and we did, and from that the baseball Tacoma evolved, and then when George Foster came in, the baseball Tacoma group sold to him. But it was really the Cubs that wanted a farm club in Tacoma. They had, I think, in Des Moines, Iowa, it was their farm club, and they decided to have this their AAA outlet.
As a matter of fact, I'm trying to think back in terms of the conversations that occurred there, because I was an intern in the office, and as I recollect, I think you were the first one that mentioned or brought up the idea of local ownership. And I think there was a lot of discussions that evolved during that period. And as I remember, you were saying local ownership is a way of really establishing AAA ball. And then the city went, and there were some other conversations with Chicago, and Chicago came in. But that's my recollection. And then again, as you point out, 6 years transpired, and then finally you and Stan and others came together and made it so.
And, you know, all the 20 owners of the ball club, they got in it just to save baseball for Tacoma, not thinking that it would be a very profitable enterprise, and it was. But local ownership, I think, was vitally needed in the early 70s, and it came to pass, and we did very well. The Cubs were experiencing, the reason they got out, they didn't, the trend then was just to have a farm operation, not ownership of a AAA ball club, and when they got out, they gave the franchise to Tacoma baseball, and Dave Rollins played a major role, and some of the other politicos also played a role, and they saved baseball, and it's been thriving and prospering ever since.
In fact, we're even looking at revisiting Cheney Stadium and upgrading that. I know the city has been considering issues in that regard, although it's a fine facility. Still, I mean, even AAA ball is moving through a period of transition.
Yeah, they put in, you know, that 10,000 seat stadium. And if you can't qualify, and that's one of the reasons that Vancouver is leaving Coast League next year, because their stadium built in, I believe, 55 doesn't seat anywhere near 10,000.
Oh, wow.
I think that number probably was set too high because there are some good franchise cities that don't have the 10,000 capacity.
On another subject, you mentioned the creation of the Tacoma Athletic Commission that came out of the efforts of Harry Kane when he was mayor, just during the war years or prior to the war years. And of course, it's flourished ever since. And one of the programs that it sponsors each and every year is the Golden Gloves. And in fact, you were an early organizer of that effort back, I guess, in the early 50s or late 40s when it first started. And I think the early matches were in the Armory, and then went on to the College of Puget Sound Fieldhouse. And during the break, I was mentioning that that's when I first got to know you, and you don't remember this, but my dad, Clarence Baarsma, worked in the dressing room taping the hands of the fighters,
right.
Along with my uncle, Harold Smitty Smith, who you knew, and I was the towel boy. I shagged the towels. And so I watched those fights, and I have all my autographed programs for those days. And it was you and Ples Irwin and a group of citizens who...
Al Whitman and
yes.
Ray Kelly.
Right. And some great fighters went through the Golden Gloves. And who were some of those great fighters, Clay?
Well, of course, the really great one, I think, was Pat McMurtry.
Right.
And but there were some others. A lot of Seattle kids came over, but Pat and his brother,
right.
Certainly Mike, who is seriously ill, by the way.
Didn't Ray Seals come through that?
Ray came later. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we've always had a great boxing program on the Hill. And it's developed into an outstanding attraction. The only one, Bill, incidentally, that survived all these years. Seattle PI used to have a Golden Gloves, and that went by the wayside. But Tacoma, over 50 years, has maintained a Golden Gloves, which, to me, I think is a tribute not only to the city, the organization TAC, but to the people of Tacoma.
Now, were you in the promotion of some of Pat's fights out there in Lincoln Bowl? Were you involved in that at all?
No, Inigola Casey was the main...
Remember the two, Ezra Charles and Willie Pastrana?
Yeah, right.
I was there for the Willie Pastrana fight.
I had a Pat McMurtry TV show after the Willie Pastrana show. Now, after the fight, they thought, well, he lost the fight. The next night we had a TV show, and his mindset was different, because he thought just before we went on a half-hour TV show that he had won the fight, but the night before he thought he had lost, and so he took me. You talk about putting a bombshell, not anticipating that he was going to take that side, that he had won the fight, because we were primed with some questions that said, well, Pat, you fought a good fight, but it was close.
Well, he chased Pastrana around the ring.
All over the ring, yeah.
Because Pastrana was a very cute fighter, but not much of a puncher, but quick and shifty. And
well, there's a Charles fight, though. That was a huge crowd in Lincoln Bowl, and Davey Ward was the referee. Stopped the fight on the low blow and gave Pat time to recuperate.
That's right.
And he went on to
win the decision.
There was some question on it. There was a question that Ezra Charles couldn't see across the ring.
Yeah.
But, and, you know, a fine gentleman, but the years in the ring took a toll, and his eyesight was diminished greatly.
Yeah, clearly past his prime.
Yeah, and whether he could see Pat, I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe the low blow was the fact that he couldn't see.
Yeah. The thing I remember, of course, you know, you're right, a lot of great fighters came through the Golden Gloves, and the one that I remember, and perhaps you remember as well, and I sat there at ringside. This was 1953 in the College of Puget Sound Fieldhouse when Pete Rademacher hit the deck. And the soldier from Fort Lewis, in fact, Pete went on to win the gold medal, and I think was undefeated as an amateur up to that fight, and had won he was the Golden Boy the year prior. You remember you were there, I'll bet. And I'll never forget. I mean, it was like, well, you know, this can't be. You know, tell me it ain't so. The great Pete Rademacher hit the deck. And I was in the dressing room prior to that fight, and Joe Davis was he was a military police officer from Fort Lewis, because Fort Lewis always brought their team out, as you remember, and he was just shaking. I mean, he just didn't, and people were trying to, you know, kind of build up his confidence. And I think he hit Pete with a straight right, and down he went. I'll never forget it. Never forget it.
I'll never forget the Rademacher-Patterson fight at Six Stadium in Seattle. Jack Hurley was the promoter. And King TV wanted to, there were some apartments up on the hill overlooking the left field fence. And Jack Hurley, of course, was a master at promotion. And King wanted to, they had a camera set up to shoot in the ring, because the ring was at the pitcher's mound at Six Stadium. And Jack had a searchlight. A real powerful searchlight, and he blasted it up on the apartment. They couldn't see, and King gave up. They didn't even try to televise any of it.
Yeah, and they had reports, I think, over the radio. I listened, you know, after each round, and actually Rademacher put Floyd Patterson down, but of course everybody did.
Yeah, right. You know, a memorable fight: Freddie Steele and Al Hostin.
Oh yeah, right.
In Seattle. And Doug, I don't know whether he remembers this, but Jerry Guillen was an early sportcaster in Tacoma. In fact, he was the first baseball announcer.
Right.
And
my longtime boss.
And your longtime boss at KTAC, but at the time he was at KMO, and he was a sportcaster. And he went to Seattle at Old Civic Stadium, where they used to play baseball on the skin portion of the diamond, right where the Seattle Center is now. And Hostak and Freddie Steele were fighting for the middleweight championship. And Guillen was going to broadcast in KMO, and he crawled up a telephone pole to do the broadcast, if you can imagine how primitive in those days it was. But that was a fight that I later became great friends with Freddie Steele. But that was a fight that really took the heart out of Tacoma boxing because they figured the business might have been played.
Oh, really?
And at least that was rumored.
Clay gives me a cue here. He said, Jerry climbed a telephone pole to do the broadcast. Clay, you've been through a few places in broadcasting. What's your greatest claim to one of those views?
Well, and I often tell this story, Bill. We did a peninsula game over at Gig Harbor. And it was a field that had very few stands. And we broadcast out of a fir tree, if you can believe it or not. And there was no broadcast booth. And then over at Kirkland, Lake Washington played Clover Park one time, and we did the game out of the front seat of a car. It was raining, the windshield wipers were going back and forth, you couldn't see the field, and you had to make some plays out, recreated the game.
Bill, I'm surprised that Clay didn't pick this one because I was there and helping him. He was doing the Whitworth PLC game in Lincoln Bowl, and the fog was so thick you couldn't see the players in the broadcast booth. I had to run down the sidelines and bring up 2 or 3 plays at a time for him to broadcast and go back down and get them, right, Clay?
And remember, Doug, if you will, the PLU defeated Whitworth.
7-6. It was Whitworth's. Jim Lounsbury had a dynasty at Whitworth. It was their only defeat of the season. And Ron Billings, who's now my neighbor, kicked the extra point to beat him 7-6. And no one knows to this day whether the ball really went through the goalposts or not.
And Tom Krause was one of the officials.
Well, that was true. A 4-minute delay.
You know, you could see that fog coming in, and you knew they should have called the game. But it came in from the north, and it kept creeping up toward the school in Old Lincoln Bowl. Well, not the present Lincoln Bowl. To this day, I can't believe that they scored a touchdown, but they did.
They threw a little flat pass. Frank Karweski threw a little flat pass out there. I forget the halfback who got it now. Anyway, he went down the sidelines. No Whitworth guy saw him. He caught it right in front of me. That's why I remember that.
That's really something. It's great.
Memories or something.
Oh yeah, they come back. These are the things that you'll never forget. The Pete Rademacher fight in the
revealing certain things, Bill, that perhaps we shouldn't be revealing at this stage of life.
Well, it's a point where you can have fun talking about those things, and then you created the Sports Hall of Fame, and that was kind of your idea. And it came to be, and during that period you had a chance to meet some real interesting characters, and I thought I'd mention some of these people and kind of comment a little bit about what your thoughts were about them. Muhammad Ali, you met him.
Well, one of the, that was during the time that all this controversy with Muhammad, and we were down at the Doric Hotel, and I sat with him for 30 minutes on a one-on-one, just sitting. I was enjoying coffee, and he was just sitting there, not maybe drinking water at the time. And to me, it was a fabulous conversation. One of the highlights. We didn't tape it or anything. It was just a one-on-one conversation, much like we're having here. And I had great respect for him then.
And then Joe Namath.
Joe was a character, although the one thing I remember about Joe, he had the Broadway image, Playboy image, but he called his mother every day. He told me this, at least, that almost every day of his life, he would call home to his mother, which gave you a different look at Joe Namath, the Playboy persona. Persona.
Joe Dimaggio.
Joe Dimaggio, we had him at our 40th luncheon down at the Tacoma Dome, and 40th TAC luncheon. and a very shy person, but a very likable person. Willie Mays was there that same day, and it's a real thrill just to be able to not only introduce Joe Dimaggio, but to talk to him and shake his hand.
And of course, Willie Mays.
And Willie, yeah. Willie was a great, I always respected his talent. Dimaggio I respected both as a man and his talent. Willie had another side of him, but as a talent, he was unsurpassed.
Bill, I don't want to steal your thunder, but I want to ask one personal one here. Sandy Koufax.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Sandy, of course, you talk about a shy, retiring person. I was amazed at the All-Star game this year that he wasn't there as one of the century players of all time. But, you know, he doesn't like the spotlight. And he's a great friend of Kenny Still, and that's why we had him in Tacoma at a Hall of Fame, and but only through the efforts of Kenny Still, who was a great Dodger fan and a great Koufax fan.
Right.
But there were we've had some great athletes. Of course, we had Billy Martin out here.
Right,
And,
I was going to mention him.
and
Another character.
Rod Carew was here, and Willie
hitter.
McCovey. Some great names.
Right, right. In fact, I saw him hit one out of the ballpark, too, out of Cheney Stadium. Yeah.
He wasn't here long, 17 days.
Yes,
but,
right. He wasn't here very
Yeah,
long.
he sure hit the
But
ball
he
well.
certainly-
Incidentally, when you were talking about that giant, you left out three of my favorites, too. We had the Alous all here.
That's
all the
right.
time. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. In fact, Manny was the first.
Right.
And
Manny was our first,
Isn't he
yeah.
the manager up in Montreal?
No, that's Felipe.
Oh,
isn't
okay.
it?
Yeah, he never
Felipe,
played. He
no,
never played.
No.
Okay.
But Matty, of course, led the National League in hitting, and
Right.
great favorite. He was the most popular player,
right.
I think, 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And two other favorites we had were Manny Mota, who later became a
Right.
great Dodger.
And still is there.
And Gil Garrido.
Right, right.
He was,
Shortstop, right?
yeah, he was the...
And then he had Sherman Roblox Jones.
Yeah.
Ah.
The great. See, I saw. I was up there
Yeah,
on the hill.
remember all these names.
I was on the hill.
Ed Honeywell gave him the roadblock name.
Yeah.
And to his dying day, he took credit for that as one of
He had an
his.
incredible ERA. I mean, it was like a 1.2 ERA. It was really incredible.
The late Ed Honeywell gave a lot of people monikers, didn't he?
Oh, he sure
He
did.
was famous for that.
Now, as we're kind of coming to the end of our discussion here, I thought I'd shift gears here a bit and talk about something, another aspect, another line of work, and that's your service as a public official, an elected official. And you ran for county commissioner successfully, and then was a candidate for governor. But how did you get into politics? By the way, I've been thinking about this. There were a lot of college of Puget Sound people right around the time that you were there, and shortly thereafter that went into politics. Buster Brulette and Lenny Sawyer and Joe Stortini and yourself. How'd that all come to be?
I think my family was raised so growing, and I always wanted to try it. I was talked into running first time. Was talked into running the second time and the third time. Now, I shouldn't have been talked in the third time, but because the third time was not my turn. But I wanted to devote time to see what I could accomplish for the Pierce County and Tacoma, and got into it. I enjoyed it, Bill, but I would not want to be in it today.
You say someone talked you into it, a number of people, or is this something that was in the back of your mind?
Well,
or?
I think it was George Sheridan one day
Okay.
mentioned, Clay, why don't you run? I think you could win. You know, there's a fear, and of course you've run, so you know there's always a fear you're going to lose.
Oh, yes.
And to be very honest with you, I think that you should lose before you win your first time out. I think you benefit from a loss. It gives you a different perspective and everything, but when you win, and you win easily, then you think you're invincible, and it comes to pass that the third time, when I ran the third time for county commissioner, I didn't really want to run, but I was talked
Kind of
into
a reluctant
running
candidate
again.
at that point. I think you ran against, was it an incumbent Republican at that time? I'm trying to think of the fellow's name. I think he was
Buck Thompson.
Yeah, he was an appointee, I believe, and you ran
Yes.
against him. A nice man, it turns out. Yeah.
And in those days, a Democrat could win
Right.
quite easily. And,
Right.
you know, you put all you make that judgment and
Sure.
go from there. But it was a good experience.
One thing you learn in politics that not everyone agrees with the decisions you make, and over time, you accumulate enemies or adversaries, or that's one thing you learn.
Yeah.
You have to live with that.
Well, it was a trying time in the 70s.
That's right, sure was.
We had the sewers going and
Right.
Development. A lot of people wanted to change the form
Right.
of government. And if I had put all that together and realized that that was the case, I would have been content with
Right.
one term.
Yeah. But those decisions were the right decisions, and sometimes you have to make the right decisions,
sure.
and then you pay the political price.
And it's
but
tough to make the right decisions.
But you look back and you say, okay, that's the right
Yeah.
thing, and you feel comfortable that you've
Yeah.
done the right thing. And also you were there during the scandals in the sheriff's
Oh
department.
yeah, and
that was tough.
That was real tough.
And I could relate because during that period, all those many years ago, I was chair of the Democratic
Yeah,
Party.
I
and that's
can
when
remember that.
we became friends as well.
Uh-huh.
That was quite an experience. You actually ran for governor, or did you actually file?
No, I today they call it the exploratory committee, and I tried for for the better part of a year, and certainly enjoyed it, going all over the state, and knowing, Bill, that I had probably two chances, slim and none.
Yeah, but some other Tacoma people were successful.
Yeah,
Al Rossellini.
and I realized that with a field, a fairly large field,
Yeah.
that there was a possibility an outsider could slip in. Dixie won
Right.
on that year.
And she is a Tacoman.
That's right,
Yeah.
Stadium High School.
Yeah,
Right.
and so you feel maybe it's a chance. I never got to the filing stage, realizing that I didn't have enough money. I wasn't going to make a successful run, so why do it? There are an awful lot of candidates running for president
Right.
that should have taken heed
Sure.
this year that you don't have a chance.
Right.
So why pursue it to the end
Right.
that you're going to almost embarrass yourself?
Right. Right.
But no, I enjoyed it, exploring the possibility. I had Governor Al Rossellini as my
That's right.
chairman, and he reasoned that there's that outside possibility that it might develop, but Dixie won, and that could have been turned too.
Yeah.
Durning ran stronger than, and Allman would have won
That's
in that
right.
case, and the whole history of the governorship in
That's
this
right.
state would have changed. Allman thought he was in, but Durning ran stronger
Right.
than he thought, and that took votes away from him.
right.
And well, you know the story.
Yeah.
And Dixie won.
And she ran kind of as an independent. I mean,
Yes.
she wasn't a real Democrat.
No.
She just was running on the ticket.
No one really knew what
Dixie was, politically speaking.
Politically speaking.
A most unique political
Yeah.
figure indeed.
But a very fascinating person.
Yeah, and very smart, very intelligent. Yeah.
Made great clam chowder.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Bill, I'd like to
Yeah.
inject something here.
Yeah.
Because I've always been a fan of Clay's and admirer of Clay's, and leaving the political contributions that he's made out of here entirely, I just want to say that I've been watching him over the years and alongside him the years, and the beneficiary of some of the things he's contributed to the community, and I just want to say to him, thanks for that. I can recall when I was in Parks and Recreation work, and it came time to build Heidelberg Park, and Clay came up with the Friends of Kids Baseball, and to this day I don't think I know how many friends there were, but Clay represented him, and he represented him well, and we built that facility because of it. I also need to recall, going back to the 50s, I had mentioned earlier, a group of largely Tacoma kids who went back and won a national baseball championship in '56, and we wouldn't even have had a place to play if it weren't for Clay Huntington and Tom Cross. And that's when Old Tiger Park went by the boards, and Clay and Tom said, well, we got to have a place for our kids to play. So they bought the ballpark. At least they put their names on the line. It wasn't shortly thereafter they were knocking on Ben Cheney's door. But my point is, this is the kind of man he is. I can recall when I was a little kid hanging around Nick's Pharmacy on 38th Street. You talk about hanging around the field house. That was my hangout. And Clay Huntington, his brother Ed, and all those great Lincoln athletes, Gordy Brunswick and Ing Thompson and Bobby McGuire, and all those guys were in their prime. And he's all to those of us who grew up in that era. He and others like him were our role models and the kinds of people we wanted to be, and they were there to give us the opportunities and the impetus and so forth to try to make something of ourselves, and particularly to try to make something of the community. He's always had a leadership role. He's assumed it without ever asking for anything back from the community. and he's contributed endlessly.
You know, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about the event that occurred about a month ago, and that kind of embarrassed Clay a little bit. There's an awful lot of accolades. You were the organizer, one of the organizers of that event, and maybe talk a little bit about how that came to be and some of the good things that have come out of it.
Well, one of Clay's friends and longtime associates is Stan Naccarato, and he's been one of mine too. And we've talked many times about let's do something for somebody while they're still with us.
Yeah, there you go.
And all of us are getting up in age. And,
sure.
And everybody's always doing something after the fact. And we talked about that and talked about that. Well, a young man who's quite active in our community, Mark Blau, who's
sure.
in Pierce County Parks, he's the one who really said, why don't you guys quit talking about that and do something about it? And he really grabbed our hands and led us along the way. So I want to give Mark a lot of credit. Clay knows that Mark's behind the Tacoma Sports
sure.
Museum and the Shanneman Sports Museum and other things. And great, you talk about memories. He's got every ounce of memorabilia that you can imagine about Tacoma's history in sports. So anyway, it was a great pleasure for us to put it together. Stan and I had the honor to MC it, kind of field some of the light moments
sure.
and add to them as we could. And hopefully Clay felt it was a great night. We called it a night of play-by-play with Clay, and more than 250 of his friends showed up you were there to praise him and not to bury him, and
right.
it was just a great evening, and I'm just really pleased to have been a part of somebody who's been very special to me in the community.
But something else happened too. It wasn't just an event. There was something that...
No, out of that event has come, the Tacoma Athletic Commission was the primary mover behind it, has come a Clay Huntington Scholarship Fund for the future, and aspiring young Tacoma Pierce County people who are going into communications, broadcasting, journalism, that type of field, are going to be beneficiary. We awarded the first two that night to aspiring young people in the fields that he's so well known for their college in the future. And that's going to be an annual event. We were able to start that fund and endow it, and the TAC must take a major share of the credit, but a lot of his friends were there too.
And so if anyone who may be looking in that would like to contribute to that could just
contact the Tacoma Athletic Commission. They'd welcome your contribution.
That's for a good cause. In fact, there were some young people that actually came forward that night and received
the first two recipients. Yes.
That was terrific. All right. Well, it's been a great hour with you both. I really enjoyed it, reminiscing and thinking about the good old days of Tacoma sports, and not the good old days necessarily Tacoma politics during that period of time, but I was there with you and of course shared some of those experiences as well. But we came through that okay, and we've done well, and hopefully we'll probably have an opportunity to see the women's world's champion soccer team in Tacoma, I guess in December at the Tacoma Dome, and we'll enjoy that experience as well. And also, I didn't mention the hockey that we defending champions, West Coast League champions.
And we didn't mention Clay used to broadcast hockey with Bob Fields out at the old Tacoma Sports Arena.
Right. It's still standing, but it's not an arena anymore.
Not an arena.
Out there on 38th Street.
I was an usher. I was a collegian at UPS at the time, and I ushered every home game of the Tacoma Rockets.
Okay. Well, it's been a terrific hour with you both, and I want to thank you, Clay in particular, to join with us in this first community conversation with a notable Tacoman. Thank you a lot, and thank you for looking and viewing in and watching this effort, and thank you, Doug, for reminiscing and helping me in this first effort. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
folks.
Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're watching the city's 24-hour information channel. TV Tacoma, the one to watch.